He knelt in the dirt before 10,000 witnesses, the most powerful alpha in the known empire, crown still on his head and pride bleeding out through every word he forced himself to say. But she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at him the way you look at a fire that already burned your house down. Not with hatred, not with longing, with the quiet understanding that some things cannot be rebuilt from ash. This is the story of Luna Serena Ashvale, the woman an empire forgot it needed until the day she walked out and never looked back. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city name in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. Mbokum. The Empire Moon Festival came around once every 7 years. 7 years was long enough for kingdoms to fall and rise again, long enough for children to be born and learn to walk and forget the world had ever been different. The festival was older than the Draven bloodline, older than the Empire's borders, a night when every wolf territory from the frozen frostwind ridges to the salt-cracked southern coasts sent tribute to the capital, when the sacred bond between Alpha King and Luna was displayed before the continent like a covenant renewed in fire and ceremony. Serena had lived through 3 of them inside these palace walls. She was 31 years old, and she could no longer remember what she had looked like the first time she stood in this courtyard. 19, someone had once told her, with the kind of quiet wonder that meant they expected her to be grateful for being noticed. 19 and naive enough to believe that a man who chose her had done so because she was worth choosing. She stood now at the dressing table in the Luna's chamber, her chamber, though she had never once felt it belonged to her, and watched the handmaiden pin the last of the silver combs into her hair. The chamber was magnificent. That was the word visitors used when they caught glimpses of it through cracked doors during court tours. Magnificent. The floors were pale stone veined with darker gray, the kind of stone quarried from the high mountains at a cost most territories couldn't afford in a decade. The wardrobe alone held more fabric than the Frostwind Village market sold in a year. There were candles in iron holders along every wall, and when they were all lit, the room glowed amber and warm and entirely false. "Your Majesty," the handmaiden said softly. "The outer cape, the white one with the silver threading, or the deep blue?" Serena looked at the 2 garments laid across the bed. The white was traditional, the ceremonial color of the festival Luna. It would photograph beautifully against the courtyard torchlight. Kalen had specified white 2 days ago through his steward. He hadn't come to specify it himself. "The white one," Serena said. Her voice came out even. That was something she had trained into herself over years of careful, necessary practice, keeping her voice even regardless of what moved beneath it. Wolves communicated in layers, the words they chose, the tone they used, the scent they couldn't entirely control. She had learned to make 2 of those 3 layers lie. The handmaiden helped her into the cape without speaking further. The girl was new, barely 17, transferred from one of the outer court households 3 months ago. She hadn't learned yet to carry conversation in this room. She hadn't learned that conversation in this room was a thing you used only when necessary, because sound traveled differently inside silence that had been maintained for years, and certain sounds could not be taken back once made. Serena sat. She looked at herself in the mirror, and the mirror gave her back what it always gave back: a woman assembled correctly. Hair pinned with precision, skin unmarked, eyes the particular shade of gray that court poets had once called winter storm and steel dawn, and a half-dozen other phrases that meant nothing specific. She was the Luna of the Draven Empire. She looked exactly as a Luna of the Draven Empire was supposed to look. She pressed one hand flat against the surface of the dressing table and held it there until she felt the cold of the stone through the wood. That was the ground, she told herself. That was real. The rest of it, the cape, the mirror, the candles, all of it was performance. She had gotten very good at knowing the difference. Der choice. The courtyard was lit with 1,000 torches by the time she descended. The great staircase opened onto the festival grounds below the palace's eastern face, and from the top of those stairs a person could see the entire assembled court, the visiting alpha delegations, the tribute columns, the long ceremonial tables heavy with offerings from every territory the Empire controlled or influenced. 7 years ago, when Serena had stood at the top of these stairs for the second time, she had still felt something looking down at all of it. Some complicated mixture of awe and displacement that hadn't resolved itself into anything cleaner. Now she counted the torches. 43 on the left perimeter, 39 on the right. The asymmetry was a maintenance failure, and it had been a maintenance failure 2 festivals ago as well. She had submitted a report to the head steward after the last ceremony. The report had been filed. Kaelin was already at the base of the stairs. He stood with the Duke of Ravensmere on one side and Lord Caisson-Vyre on the other, 3 men whose collective confidence occupied space the way a storm occupied a valley, filling it, changing the pressure of everything around it. Kaelin Draven was 46 years old and built like the Empire itself had decided to take human form, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired going silver at the temples, in a way that seemed deliberate, with the kind of face that had been handsome for so long it had moved past handsomeness into something more architectural. He wore the deep charcoal ceremonial coat with the Empire's sigil in gold at the collar, and he was laughing at something Vir had said. He did not look toward the stairs. Serena descended. She counted her steps, not because she needed to, but because counting was a thing she did with her hands and her feet and her breath when the alternative was feeling the full weight of what she was walking into. She reached the bottom step, and the nearest courtier, a young woman from the Caldwell household, one of the new appointments, turned and dipped her head in that particular greeting reserved for the Luna, the one that acknowledged her rank without requiring the full formal bow used for the Alpha King. "Your Majesty," the woman said. "Lady Caldwell," Serena returned, and kept walking. She reached Kaelin's circle. The Duke of Ravensmere noticed her first and straightened slightly. Lord Vyre turned a moment later. Kaelin finished the last beat of whatever Vyre had said, let the laughter settle, and then turned as well. His eyes moved over her the way you check a piece of furniture you've rearranged, confirming it's where it's supposed to be. "You're late," he said. "By 4 minutes," Serena said. "The procession doesn't begin for another 12. The Beta delegation from Thornwall arrived early. They've been waiting." Then perhaps someone should have ensured they were greeted appropriately when they arrived, rather than left standing while the hosting party finished a private conversation. Vir looked away. He was good at that, Vir, finding something to examine in the middle distance whenever the air between her and Kaelin turned edge-sharp. Kaelin's jaw moved once, the kind of small, controlled movement that meant he was deciding whether to address what she'd said or absorb it and redirect. He was better at this than most people realized. The court thought of him as impulsive, the warrior king, the alpha who trusted his instincts and struck first. But Serena had lived inside his calculations for 12 years, and she knew the instinct was only one layer. Beneath it was arithmetic, cost and benefit, always. "Go greet them," he said. "That's your function tonight." "Your function." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Not long enough to become a challenge, long enough to be deliberate. Then she turned toward the Thornwall delegation. Ambassador Lyric Fenn of Thornwall was a small, wire-thin woman in her late 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from having navigated courts far more dangerous than this one. She stood with her 2 aides at the edge of the receiving line, watching the festival preparations with the neutral expression of someone who had learned to reveal nothing before the actual meeting began. She saw Serena coming and let something shift, barely, a small warming in the set of her mouth. "Luna Ashvale," she said. "Ambassador Fenn." Serena took the woman's hands in both of hers, the Thornwall greeting. "I apologize for the delay in your welcome. The evening has been eventful before it's begun," Fenn said, and the warmth in her eyes said she understood exactly what kind of evening it was and had probably understood from the moment she arrived. "We've been perfectly comfortable. Your head steward brought wine from the Southern Press. Excellent vintage." "I'll pass that along. How was the journey from the border?" "Cold and long and worth it, if tonight goes the way I hope." Fenn squeezed her hands once before releasing them. "The Alpha King as well?" "He is." "And you?" The question was quiet. Not performative. Lyric Fenn had not gotten to her position by performing wellness inquiries at people who weren't listening. She was actually asking. Serena smiled, and the smile was real enough because Fenn was one of approximately 4 people in this courtyard she didn't need to entirely manufacture emotion for. "I'm enduring," Serena said. Fenn's eyes held hers. "That," she said, "is not the same as well." "No," Serena agreed. "It isn't." The ceremony began at the 9th bell. It followed the structure it had followed for as long as the Draven line had held the Empire. Alpha King and Luna standing before the assembled territories, the Empire's sigil lit in ceremonial fire, the formal declaration of the bond's continuation, the acknowledgement of each visiting delegation in order of territorial standing. It was long and cold, and the stone flags of the courtyard conducted both the chill of the ground and the distant vibrations of the crowd in a way that crept up through Serena's thin-soled festival slippers and made her calves ache by the first hour. She stood at Kaelin's left, 2 steps back, as protocol required. She had stood in this position so many times that her body now found it automatically, the way it found the placement of her limbs in sleep. Left, 2 steps back, within the visible frame of his silhouette, but not beside him. Present, but subordinate. Symbol, but not participant. The declarations went without incident through the first 6 delegations. It was during the 7th, the Ashfin territory, one of the border regions that had only formally joined the Empire in the last decade, that Kaelin introduced the change in the program. "Before we continue," he said, and his voice carried the way it always carried, filling the courtyard without apparent effort, "I want to recognize someone who has been an exceptional representative of the Empire's values at our northern borders." Serena's spine went still. "Lady Mira Valdine," Kaelin said, "come forward." And Mira Valdine came forward from the 3rd row of the assembled guests, and the torchlight caught her the way it had been designed to catch someone positioned exactly where she'd been standing, with intention, with staging. And Serena understood in the space of one breath that this had been planned. Mira was 28. She was everything a particular kind of story casts as the contrast. Dark where Serena was pale, warm where Serena was controlled, the kind of open beauty that photographs as unaffected even when it is not. She was the daughter of the Valdine trading house, and she had been a figure in the Capitol Court for 3 years, and for the last 14 months she had been precisely what everyone discussed in the corridors and precisely what no one discussed in rooms where Serena might be present. "Lady Valdine has served as the Empire's envoy to the Frost March negotiations," Kaelin said, and his voice had shifted, not substantially, not enough that anyone who didn't know him would catch it, but Serena had 12 years of knowing him, and she caught the shift like a stone catching light. "And through her efforts alone, we have secured trade agreements that will benefit this empire for a generation. Her dedication, her intelligence, and her loyalty to the empire are without equal." Without equal. Serena stood at Kaelin's left, 2 steps back, and she breathed. The court applauded. Several of the visiting delegations joined because applauding when the Alpha King applauded was simply the mechanism of rooms like this one. Ambassador Fenn, in the Thornwall section, did not applaud. Serena watched the older woman's face from the corner of her vision and saw the careful stillness there, the conscious decision not to. Kaelin descended the 2 steps from the platform and took Mira Valdine's hand and raised it, the gesture of formal recognition. And it looked like 100 things it was not supposed to look like. And every person in the courtyard knew it, and every person in the courtyard watched Serena to see what she would do. She stood where she stood. She breathed. She did not move. The banquet hall after the ceremony was the particular kind of crowded that made each individual's position in a room a political statement. Serena sat at the high table, the Luna's seat to the Alpha King's right, and ate 4 bites of roasted grain and drank 1 cup of wine slowly, over the course of an hour. Kaelin talked to Vyre across the table for most of it. He talked to the Ravensmere Duke about trade leverage at the southern ports. He talked to the new military appointment, a young alpha named Kor, barely 25, with the kind of aggressive energy that courts always produced around men who hadn't yet learned which battles cost more than they won, about the border patrol restructuring. He talked to virtually everyone within arm's reach. He did not talk to Serena. This was not unusual. She had learned years ago not to catalog his silences by how personal they were, because the accounting made something in her chest track damage in a way she couldn't afford. But tonight the silence had a different quality. Tonight the silence was also an audience. Every time the table conversation turned and someone's gaze slid toward her, checking, always checking, the way you check something you're waiting to break. She felt the weight of the courtyard ceremony still hanging in the air like smoke after the torches went out. She set down her cup. "Kaelin." His name came out quiet, because this was not an argument she intended to have at the high table. She was very clear about that with herself even as she said it. Not here, not now, but needing to plant the fact of the conversation for later. He turned, a beat too slow, the kind of slow that was itself a message. "We need to discuss the evening's program," she said. "The program went well." It went... She stopped. She breathed. It went without the kind of incident that required immediate management. That is not the same as going well. Mira's recognition was deserved. The Frost March agreements. I have read the Frost March agreements. I read every agreement that crosses the Empire's formal seals, as is my function. She used the word deliberately, let it sit. The recognition was not my concern. The presentation was. The presentation was honest. "No," Serena said, and kept her voice level the way you keep a blade level before the strike, steady and committed. "The presentation was a statement. You chose to make it during the ceremony, from the platform, with the visiting delegations watching. That was a choice." Kalen looked at her, the way he looked at objections from counselors he had already decided not to hear. "You're tired," he said. "This conversation will make more sense in the morning." "It makes perfect sense right now." "Serena." He turned back to Vire. The conversation resumed. She was excused from it, and she had not excused herself. She sat. She looked at her wine. She thought about a thing she'd heard once, from one of the old wolves in the archive district when she'd gone looking for historical records about early empire structures. One of those conversations that happened sideways, not as teaching but as the passing of something between two people in the same room. He'd been talking about territory wars, about the nature of endurance. He'd said, "There's a point where staying isn't strength anymore. It's just the habit of pain pretending it's commitment." She had written it down. She still had the paper somewhere in the drawer beside the bed that was hers alone. She picked up her cup and finished the wine. It was Voss who found her in the corridor outside the East Wing 2 hours later. Voss Alrin, palace steward, 30 years in service to the Draven House before Serena had arrived, and 17 years since, was not a man who found people by accident. He had the build of someone who had been made for physical work and had redirected that capacity into the logistics of empire management, and he moved through the palace corridors with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had a destination before he started walking. "Your Majesty," he said, falling into step beside her without preamble, "there's a situation in the South Gallery." Define situation. "Lady Valdine is receiving congratulations from several members of the outer court. The gathering has grown. Some of the visiting delegates have joined it." A pause. "Lord Vire is facilitating." Serena walked. "Vire facilitated the positioning in the courtyard as well," she said. "I couldn't confirm that." "You don't have to confirm it." She turned the corner that led to the South Gallery's outer corridor. "How long has it been gathering?" 40 minutes, roughly. I thought you should know before someone else brought it to you with editorializing." "The editorializing would have come from someone who wanted to watch my face." "Yes." She stopped walking. Through the corridor wall, she could hear the distant sound of the gathering. Not words, just the warm, ambient noise of many people relaxing into celebration, the clink of glasses, the particular register of laughter that comes from rooms where status is being performed and everyone is enjoying the performance. "How many of the visiting alphas are in there?" she asked. "At least 4. Ravensmere, the Ashfin chief, one of the Thornwall junior delegates, and Alpha Corps." "Not Fen." "Ambassador Fen retired early. She sent her regards to you specifically." Serena noted that, filed it. "And the Alpha King?" Voss was quiet for a half-second longer than the answer required. "He arrived approximately 15 minutes ago," he said. There it was. Not a thing she hadn't known was coming. She had known it the way you know weather by the way the air tastes before the storm actually arrives. But knowing and encountering were different phenomena, and the encounter, even second-hand through a stone corridor wall, sat differently in the body than the knowing had. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. Voss walked with her. He didn't speak for a full corridor's length. "Your Majesty," he said finally. "Not tonight, Voss." "I understand." "Thank you for telling me." "Of course." He stopped at the branching corridor, the path that led back toward the main hall. "Is there anything you need?" Serena thought about the drawer beside the bed, the paper in it, the words she had written down years ago because something in her had known, even then, that she might one day need to read them back to herself. "No," she said. Not tonight. Disrupt. She did not go back to the banquet hall. She did not go to the South Gallery. She did not seek out any of the 4 senior council members whose opinions she had spent months carefully cultivating, or the 2 territorial representatives she had been meaning to speak with about the northern grain distribution failures, or the Thornwall connection she might have used tonight to build something real. She went to the archive room on the 3rd level of the east wing, the one that smelled of old binding and the faint mineral trace of the mountain stone in the walls, and she sat down in the chair she had claimed years ago as the one she came to when she needed to be somewhere she could think. She sat for a long time. The festival sounds carried dimly through the outer walls, distant music, the occasional sharp upswing of crowd noise when something ceremonial happened in the courtyard. 7 years from now, there would be another Empire Moon Festival. The torches would be lit. The delegations would assemble. The Luna would stand 2 steps behind and to the left. She pressed her hand flat against the table. Cold stone through old wood. That was the ground. She thought about what she had said to Fen. Enduring. That is not the same as well. Fen had heard the distinction and not pretended she hadn't. There was a document in the library's formal collection, a territorial record from 80 years back, detailing the dissolution of the Marveth Highland Agreement, one of the Empire's oldest alliances. The record was dry in the way all administrative documents were dry, the language stripped of everything but fact and precedent. But at the end of it, the presiding arbitrator had written a note in the margin in handwriting different from the formal text. She had found it 3 years ago and she still remembered what it said. A bond maintained by one party's endurance alone is not a bond. It is a leash. She stood. She walked to the window. Below her, the festival courtyard was still half lit, the torches burning lower now, a few scattered attendants moving between the ceremonial structures. She could see the entrance to the South Gallery from here. Warm light leaking from the tall windows, silhouettes moving inside. She could see for a moment the shape of a woman near one of those windows, laughing at something, and beside her a shape that was taller, broader, unmistakable even at this distance. Serena watched for 3 seconds. Then she turned away from the window and walked back to her chamber. The handmaiden had left the room tidy and dark except for 2 candles near the bed. Serena dismissed the evening attendant who waited in the outer antechamber and closed both doors and stood in the quiet. She did not remove her cape immediately. She stood in the middle of the room, still in the white festival cape with the silver threading, and she looked at the wardrobe and the candles and the magnificent floor, and she thought with a precision that was almost physical about the 12 years she had spent in this palace. The first 3 had been bewilderment. She had grown up in a mid-tier territory, the daughter of a former alpha who had stepped back from formal leadership before she was born, and she had understood something about power dynamics in the abstract without having lived at the center of one. The bewilderment of those first years had been genuine, not naivety exactly, but the honest confusion of someone navigating a system whose actual rules bore almost no resemblance to the rules written down. The next 4 had been adaptation. She had learned, in the specific and granular way you learn something when your survival depends on the learning, how this court worked, who held what, who owed what to whom, which alliances were real and which were theater. She had become useful in ways that were not visible in the official record. The Thornwall relationship, which Fen had referenced tonight with that quiet warmth. Serena had built that over 2 years of correspondence, one carefully managed visit at a time. The grain distribution network for the Northern Territories, which had prevented 2 separate supply crises from becoming actual famines. Serena had rebuilt that after she identified the structural failures in the original system. None of it appeared under her name. That had been fine. She had told herself it was fine. She had told herself that the work itself was the thing that mattered, that the work was real even when the credit wasn't, that she was building something that would outlast the particular cruelties of any given season. The last 5 years had been something she did not yet have a clean name for. She reached up and removed one of the silver combs from her hair. It caught the candlelight as she held it. She had been told, at 19, that becoming the Alpha King's mate was the greatest thing the Empire could offer a woman. She had been told this by a dozen different voices. Her mother, the territory representatives who negotiated the arrangement, the court women who descended on her with preparations and protocols, and the particular competitive kindness of people adjusting to a new hierarchy. She had been told this, and she had believed it, and then she had learned what the Empire actually offered her, and she had endured that learning, and kept enduring, and kept calling the endurance strength. She set the comb on the table. She looked at the royal crest on the wall above the wardrobe. The Empire's sigil, mounted there because every chamber in this palace carried it. An eagle above a mountain peak, the Draven dynasty's claim rendered in gold-painted iron. She reached up and removed the second comb. She thought about Voss's face in the corridor, about Fenn's hand holding hers, about the margin note in the 80-year-old document in different handwriting from the formal record. A bond maintained by one party's endurance alone is not a bond. She thought about the South Gallery window, the silhouettes, the 3 seconds she had watched before she turned away. She thought about the fact that turning away had not hurt the way it used to hurt. She wasn't sure when that had changed. She wasn't sure if the absence of a certain pain meant healing or meant something important had simply stopped working, the way a nerve stops conducting when the damage goes deep enough. She crossed the room to the chest beside the bed and opened the top drawer. The paper was where she had left it years ago, soft with folding and refolding. She didn't need to open it. She knew what it said. There's a point where staying isn't strength anymore. It's just the habit of pain pretending it's commitment. She held the folded paper. She stood in the middle of the magnificent room, still in the festival cape. And she made a decision with the particular quietness that comes after a long time of almost deciding. Not dramatic, not announced, not even especially emotional. Just the clean sensation of something settling into place after years of being held in the wrong position. She walked to the wardrobe. She removed the royal crest from the wall above it. She held it for a moment. The weight of it was always surprising, heavier than it looked. She set it on the wardrobe shelf, facing inward. She changed out of the festival cape herself, without calling anyone. She pulled on the plain traveling clothes that she kept at the bottom of the clothing chest beneath the formal wear. Clothes she had put there 14 months ago, when the knowing had first begun to feel like certainty, because she had wanted to be sure they were there if she ever needed them. She took the satchel from under the bed. She had packed it in portions over those same 14 months, slowly, nothing that would be noticed missing from any single inventory. She was almost at the door when she stopped. She turned back to the dressing table. The silver combs were still there. She left them. She left the cape. She left everything that had been hers in the way that decorative objects in a room are yours. Assigned, not chosen. She took the folded paper from the drawer. She put it in the satchel. She opened the door, and the corridor was quiet in the way that corridors are quiet after midnight, when the festival noise has finally faded. And she walked down the servants' staircase she had identified 3 years ago as the one with the most consistent blind spots in the guard rotation. And she came out through the kitchen passage and crossed the outer courtyard under a sky that was moving toward the particular dark blue that precedes the first gray of dawn. And she walked through the small gate in the eastern wall that the supply drivers used before the market runs, and she kept walking. She did not look back. Behind her, the festival grounds were dark and still. The torches had burned down to their bases. The ceremonial decorations shifted in the pre-dawn wind. In the south wing, in the master chamber 2 floors above where hers had been, a light was still on. She did not look back. She walked until the palace was behind the ridgeline, and then she kept walking, because the only direction that made any sense now was forward, and because 12 years of building things for an empire that filed her name under function rather than fact had given her, at minimum, one thing the empire had not anticipated. She knew exactly how it worked. She knew every alliance she had built, every agreement she had quietly held together, every supply line and diplomatic channel and territorial relationship that ran, invisible, through the infrastructure of the Draven throne. She knew what she had made. And for the first time in 12 years, she was going to build something for herself. 3 days later, in the capital, the Alpha King's chamberlain entered the Luna's chamber to deliver the morning correspondence and found it empty. The festival cape was folded neatly on the bed. The silver combs were on the dressing table. The royal crest was on the wardrobe shelf, facing inward. The chamberlain stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the empty room. Then he walked very quickly to find Voss. And Voss stood in the same doorway and looked at the same empty room, and he thought about a corridor conversation 2 nights ago, and the sound of footsteps walking away, and something he recognized in them that he had not been able to name until now. He thought, "She told me she didn't need anything that night. She had already had everything she needed." He closed the door quietly. He turned to the chamberlain, and he said the words that would reach the Alpha King within the hour, and travel from there through every corner of the capital by nightfall, the words that no one in the court's history had ever said before. The Luna is gone. The word traveled the way bad news always travels in a palace, faster than it should, slower than the people it would hurt most deserved. Voss told the chamberlain to say nothing to the morning staff. The chamberlain lasted 4 minutes before he said something to the undercook, who said something to the head laundress, who said something to the senior guard on the east rotation. By the time Voss reached the Alpha King's outer chamber, the corridor outside it already had 2 more people in it than protocol required, both of them standing very still with the careful blankness of servants who know something significant has happened and have not yet decided how to carry the knowledge. Voss dismissed them with a look. He knocked once and opened the door. Kalen was at the window. He was already dressed, the plain dark training clothes, not the formal wear, which meant he'd been awake before the chamberlain's report reached him, or he'd dressed fast once it did. He was looking out at the eastern courtyard where the festival cleanup crews were working in the early gray light, stacking the ceremonial structures onto transport carts, rolling the torch stands back toward the storage outbuildings. He didn't turn when Voss entered. "Tell me what you know," he said. "Her chamber is empty. The festival cape is folded on the bed. The royal crest has been removed from the wall and placed on the wardrobe shelf. The silver combs are on the dressing table." Voss paused. "The traveling chest under the bed is open. It's been cleared." Kalen was quiet for a long moment. "When?" "Sometime after the second bell. The East Kitchen Passage guard rotation has a gap between the first and third quarter of that hour. I identified it 2 years ago and submitted a report to the security steward. It was filed." The echo of Serena's words from the night before, which Voss had not been present for, but had heard about through the particular atmospheric transmission that operated in courts like this one, sat in the space between that sentence and the next one. Kalen turned from the window. His face was doing something complicated. Voss had served the Draven House for 47 years total, had watched 2 Alpha Kings and 1 Regent manage crises ranging from border invasions to crop failures to the particular kind of internal unraveling that came from poor succession planning, and he had become over those decades fluent in the facial expressions of men confronting things they had not believed would actually happen. What Kalen's face was doing right now was not anger, it was the expression of a man recalculating. "She planned this," Kalen said. "The evidence suggests so, over an extended period." "How extended?" "The traveling clothes were already in the chest. The satchel contents were not assembled last night." Voss kept his voice even. "Months, at minimum." Kalen moved away from the window. He sat down in the chair behind his working table, not heavily, not with any visible distress, but with the deliberateness of someone deciding to be seated rather than standing for what came next. "Find her," he said. "With respect, Alpha King, where would you suggest we begin?" "Every territory with an open border. The Eastern Roads first. She knows people in Thornwall. Ambassador Fenn departed this morning at dawn." The silence that followed that sentence was a different quality than the silences before it. "Fenn knew," Kalen said. "I couldn't confirm that." "You don't have to." He stood again. The recalculating expression had settled into something colder and more familiar. The face he wore going into territory negotiations where he already knew the other party had more leverage than they should. "Get Vire and Core. I want them here before the court hour starts." "And the court itself?" Kalen looked at him. "The Luna is resting," he said. "Traveling fatigue from the festival preparations. She'll receive visitors when she's ready." Voss held his gaze. "For how long can that hold?" "Long enough to find her before it doesn't have to." Chaz. Vire arrived first, which told Voss something, though Voss had stopped being surprised by Vier's capacity for information 12 years ago. Lord Kaysun Vier was 51 years old and had the particular quality of men who had been very handsome in their youth and had spent the intervening decades converting the social capital that beauty generated into something more durable. He was not cruel exactly. He was convenient, which in Voss's experience was worse, because cruelty at least had limits built into its own nature, whereas convenience would shape itself to whatever the room required. He walked into the Alpha King's chamber, took in the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and sat down across from Kalen without being invited to. "The court already knows something's off," he said. "Lady Harwick asked me on the way up whether the Luna was unwell." "What did you tell her?" "That I hadn't seen you or the Luna this morning and couldn't speak to either's condition." He leaned back. "That buys maybe 2 hours. After that, the festival guests start departing. The formal farewells begin, and the Luna is expected to stand for them. I know the protocol. Then you know we have a problem that doesn't keep. Vire looked at him steadily. Where did she go? That's what I'm working on. Kaelin. The use of the name without the title was a thing Veer did only in private, and only when he wanted the statement to land without the buffer of formality. She didn't pack a bag last night on an impulse. This was architecture, which means she had resources somewhere, which means someone helped her. Kor arrived then, which cut the sentence short. He was breathing slightly faster than usual. He'd come quickly from wherever he'd been, which meant Voss's page had found him moving rather than stationary. The young Alpha read the room, straightened, and stood near the door with the particular posture of someone determined to look useful before they'd been told what the use was. Sit down, Kor, Kaelin said. Kor sat. You were in the South Gallery last night. Kaelin didn't make it a question. Yes, Alpha King. Did the Luna speak to anyone before the gallery gathering began? Anyone you noticed moving against the crowd's direction? Kor thought about it. I saw her speak with Voss in the East Corridor, and she greeted the Thornwall delegation early in the evening. Ambassador Fenn, specifically? Yes. Kaelin looked at Voss. Voss said nothing. All right, Kaelin said. Here's what happens today. The Luna is resting. That holds through the morning farewells. Vire, you coordinate the departures. Keep the Thornwall delegation engaged if they haven't left yet. I want every outbound road from the capital watched by midday. Kor, you take the eastern border check stations personally. Don't send word ahead. Arrive and ask your questions after. And if she's already passed the eastern border, Vire said. Kaelin's jaw moved once. Then we adjust. She has contacts in at least 4 territories. If she's been planning this for months, she's placed people, resources, possibly safe houses. Vire was not being cruel about it. He was being useful, which was its own kind of merciless. She's not running Kaelin, she's relocating. The silence in the room was the kind that comes after a true thing is said in a space that wasn't ready for it. Kaelin stood very still. Find her, he said again. The words were exactly the same as before, but the texture of them had changed. The first real crack appeared at the 3rd hour. It came not from the court gossip, which had been building steadily and was now operating at the particular vibration of a string held too tight, but from the south. A rider from the Ashfin territory bringing a report that the grain distribution transfer scheduled for the post-festival week had hit a bureaucratic blockage. The agreement terms were disputed. The Ashfin chief was requesting clarification of the Luna's formal authorization, which had been embedded in the original distribution compact. The Luna's authorization. Voss took the report from the rider himself and held it for several minutes before he brought it to Kaelin. Kaelin read it twice. Who handles this if not her? He said, not to Voss specifically, but to the room. The compact was structured with her as the primary signatory, Voss said. She built the framework. The Distribution Council reports to her office. Without her formal authorization, the autumn transfer sits in administrative suspension until a new signatory authority is established. How long does that take? Weeks, if the council is cooperative. Months, if anyone decides to raise procedural challenges. Voss paused. The Ashfin chief is already raising procedural challenges. Kaelin put the report down on the table. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man beginning to understand the dimensions of a room he thought he already knew. What else runs through her office? He said quietly. Voss placed a second document beside the first, then a third. He had prepared them that morning, in the 2 hours between finding the empty chamber and reaching Kaelin's door. He had known this moment was coming. He had known it because he had watched Serena Ashvale build the invisible architecture of this empire's function for 12 years, and he had watched the Alpha King not see it, and he had filed his own observations under the category of things that were not his place to say. Today, he supposed, it had become his place. The Thornwall Trade Compact, he said, laying each document down in turn. The Northern Grain Distribution Network covering 11 territories. The Border Clinic supply arrangements in the Frostmarch region. The 3-party water rights mediation currently in the 4th month of a negotiation that's prevented 2 territorial conflicts from becoming military ones. The correspondence archive for the Ravensmere Shipping Alliance, which is renewed annually and is due for renewal in 6 weeks. He stopped. He looked at the Alpha King. There's more, he said. "This is the surface." Kalen was looking at the documents. He had the stillness of a man who is doing arithmetic and does not like where the numbers are going. "She built all of this," he said. "Yes, under my authority." "In your name," Voss said carefully. "The mechanisms themselves, the relationships, the frameworks, the trust of the counterparties, those were built through her. The parties involved engaged with her. They know her signature, her handwriting, her way of conducting a meeting. Replacing the administrative signatory is procedurally possible. Replacing what she represents to those relationships is considerably more complex." Kalen pushed back from the table. He stood. He walked to the window again, the same window he'd been at when Voss first arrived, looking out at the same eastern courtyard, now cleared of the festival cleanup crews, the space returning to its ordinary emptiness. "She knew this would happen," he said. "She's been building it for 12 years. It would be extraordinary if she hadn't considered the structural implications. She designed this." Not an accusation. Not quite. The tone of a man examining a mechanism he has just discovered has been running under his feet the entire time. Voss said nothing. "She walked out," Kalen said, "and took the Empire's connective tissue with her." "She didn't take anything," Voss said, and the care in his voice was the care of a man choosing words the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground. "Everything she built is still here. In the archives, in the compacts, in the institutional record. What she took was herself. The rest is simply less functional without the person who made it work." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Kalen turned from the window. His face had moved through the recalculation and the cold strategic focus and had arrived somewhere Voss hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen in a long time, not since before the weight of the crown had reshaped it into the architecture of command. Something rawer, something that didn't have a court name. "Binder," he said for the third time. But this time Voss heard something different in the words. Not the order to retrieve an asset, not the reflex of a man reclaiming what he considered his. Something that sounded, under the control and the cold and the years of practiced distance, like a man who had just realized he was standing in a room that had always been held up by a pillar he'd never once looked at directly. And the pillar was gone. And the ceiling was beginning to move. The rider reached the Frostwind border crossing at dusk. He was carrying a message with the Alpha King's seal. Not a formal dispatch, not a court document. A single folded paper, handwritten, with her name on the outside in Kalen's own hand. The crossing guard on the Frostwind side took the message, looked at the seal, and went to find the woman it was addressed to. He found Serena Ashvale sitting at a plain wooden table in the borderway station's common room, eating bread and hard cheese and drinking water from a clay cup, wearing clothes that no one in the Empire's capital court would have recognized as belonging to the Luna. She looked up when the guard came in. He held out the message. She looked at it for a long moment, at the seal, at her own name in the handwriting she had known for 12 years. She looked back at her bread. "Take it back," she said. The guard blinked. "My lady, I'm not your lady." Her voice was even, not unkind, just accurate. "I'm a woman eating her supper. Take the message back to whoever sent the rider and tell them the border crossing is closed for the night." The guard stood in the doorway for another moment, clearly uncertain whether this was the kind of situation his position had prepared him for. Serena took another bite of bread. He left. She chewed, she swallowed, she set down her cup and looked at the table's grain, the old wood worn smooth in the places where countless hands had rested over however many years this way station had stood here. She thought about the pillar. She had known, building it, that the day she stopped holding it up the ceiling would shift. She had not built it as a weapon. She had built it because she was there, and the work needed doing, and she was the kind of person who did the work that needed doing, regardless of whether anyone was watching. But she had understood, in those months of careful, quiet preparation, that the architecture she had spent 12 years constructing was also, structurally, the clearest argument she could make for what her absence would cost. Not leverage. Leverage implied a negotiation she intended to have. This was evidence. Evidence of what she had actually been, in that palace, in that empire, in that marriage. Evidence she was leaving behind for whoever needed to understand it. She finished her supper. She rinsed the cup at the basin. She walked to the small room at the back of the way station that she had paid for with her own coin from a private account she had established 7 years ago in the name of a trade documentation service, one of 3 such accounts, all of them legitimate, all of them entirely unconnected to the Luna's household records. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She reached into the satchel and took out the folded paper, and she held it in both hands, and she thought about the writer who'd come with a sealed message and her name on it in handwriting she had once loved. She thought about the ceiling beginning to shift. She put the paper back in the satchel. She lay down on the narrow, plain mattress in the small way station room, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, she slept without listening for footsteps in the corridor outside her door. She slept clean through the night. And in the morning, she crossed into Frostwind territory, and behind her in the capital, the Alpha King's first counselor was informing him that the Ravensmere Shipping Alliance had sent an inquiry about the renewal correspondence. The water rights mediation had stalled without warning, and 3 of the northern grain territories had received conflicting signals from the Distribution Council's acting office. And somewhere in the Thornwall delegation's departed entourage, a secondary message arrived at Ambassador Fenn's receiving post, a brief handwritten note, unsigned, that said only, "I'm across. The bread here is plain, but it's mine." Fenn read it twice. She folded it very carefully. She put it in her personal correspondence file, in the section she kept locked, and she sent back a single word. Good. 6 weeks into Frostwind, Serena learned that peace was a skill, same as any other, and she was starting from the beginning. The territory was not what the capital's records described. The capital's records described Frostwind as a remote, sparsely populated wolf region of limited strategic value, economically subsistence level, politically negligible. The records had been written by people who had never been here, drawing from census data submitted by border administrators who had also never been here, building a picture of a place from the outline of its absence in more important conversations. What Frostwind actually was: cold in the mornings with a specific bite that came off the ridge ice, not brutally, but honestly, the kind of cold that told you exactly where you stood. The market ran 3 days a week in the central village, and the people who ran it knew each other by name and knew each other's business, and were suspicious of strangers in the particular way of communities that had learned suspicion was a reasonable investment. The pack structure was loose by Empire standards, no formal alpha title, a council of 7 elders who made decisions by the slow method of actual consensus, which meant nothing happened fast, but what did happen had been tested against the objections of everyone who would live with it. Serena rented a room above a supply trader named Holt, paid in advance for 2 months, gave her name as Serene, not a lie, just a reduction, and said she was from the mid-territory border region and had come north for the quiet. Holt was 63 and had the eyes of a man who had heard most available reasons for arriving somewhere and had learned to evaluate them by what they left out rather than what they included. He looked at her for a long moment. "You got trouble following?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "but possibly." "Possibly." He nodded. He gave her the key. He charged her a fair price, and she recognized it as fair because she had spent 12 years reading supply compacts, and she knew what fair looked like from the inside. The work came naturally because the work was the same work underneath the different conditions. She started at the market. She bought what she needed, and she paid what was asked, and she did not negotiate in the first weeks because negotiating before you understood a market's actual price structures was how you built a reputation for being either predatory or naive. And she needed neither. She listened to what people complained about. She listened to what they were proud of. She learned the names of the elder council members, not by asking directly, but by paying attention to whose opinion other people cited in conversation. By the 4th week, she had a sense of Frostwind's structural problem, which was the same structural problem she had watched developing in 2 Northern Empire territories before she had intervened. A distribution bottleneck at the eastern supply route that was inflating prices on 6 categories of essential goods, and had been doing so for long enough that people had stopped noticing it as an aberration and started absorbing it as a fact of life. She wrote a note to Elder Moret, the council member whose name came up most often in market conversations, proposing a meeting. Moret was 68 years old, built close to the ground, with white hair she kept braided and eyes the particular sharp pale brown of someone whose primary tool had always been observation. She came to the meeting at Holt's supply room. Serena hadn't suggested a formal venue because she didn't have the standing for one yet, and sat across the table and looked at Serena the same way Holt had. "You know distribution logistics," Mairead said. It wasn't a question. "I've had some experience." "From where?" "The Mid-Territories, Trade Administration." "All of it technically true." Mairead looked at the notes Serena had laid out on the table. She looked at them for a long time. "If you're right about the Eastern Route bottleneck," she said, "fixing it takes council approval, territorial cooperation from 2 adjacent settlements, and probably 3 months of implementation." "Yes," Serena said, "you're willing to work on that timeline." "I'm not going anywhere." Mairead looked up from the notes. The sharp pale eyes did something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The expression of someone who has been doing hard work for a long time and has just noticed that the person across the table has also been doing hard work for a long time, and there might be a conversation here worth having. "All right," she said, "come to the council meeting Thursday, 2. The message from Voss arrived on a Tuesday in the 7th week. It came through Fenn's network. Serena had expected this, had known Voss would eventually find the thread of how she'd gotten word to Fenn, had known he would use it not to report her location to Kaylin, but to reach her directly, because Voss was one of the 4 people she trusted, and he had earned that trust across years of small, consistent choices. He had chosen not to file reports about things he noticed. He had chosen to tell her about the South Gallery situation before someone brought it to her with editorializing. He had chosen silence, repeatedly, when speech would have served his position better. The message was brief. Voss wrote briefly. She had always appreciated that about him. The water rights mediation collapsed in week 3. The Ravensmere shipping alliance is threatening non-renewal. The Northern Grain Distribution Network is running at partial function. 4 territories cooperative, 7 in dispute. And Kaylin has dispatched search parties to the Eastern territories. Corps leads the Eastern route detail. They have not found you. They are not, I think, looking in the right direction. I have not assisted them in looking in any direction. Then, at the end, in the same unhurried handwriting, the South Gallery gatherings have stopped. I do not know if this is relevant. I thought you should know. Serena read the message twice. She folded it and put it with the paper from the drawer. The 2 documents she was keeping, both of them small enough to fit in a coat pocket. She thought about the water rights mediation. She had been in the 4th month of a negotiation between 3 territorial councils over a river that crossed 2 borders, and she had known when she left that the mediation would stall without her. Not because no one else was capable of the work, but because she had spent 4 months building the specific trust architecture between 3 sets of people who didn't naturally trust each other, and trust architecture doesn't transfer to a new party the way a document transfers. You can hand someone the file. You can't hand them the relationship. She thought about this without guilt. Guilt was a thing she had done a great deal of in the first years, when she had still believed that absorbing damage quietly was the same as managing it. She had learned the difference between absorbing and managing in year 5 or 6, she couldn't precisely remember when, only that there had been a point where she noticed the damage was still accumulating regardless of how quietly she absorbed it. What she felt looking at Voss's message was not guilt. It was the clear-eyed recognition of consequence, the cost of her leaving, tallied by someone who had watched her work and understood what it had been holding up. She wrote back, "Thank you for the information. Do not assist in any direction. Take care of yourself." She folded the reply and gave it to the trader who ran Fenn's route. Then she went to the Thursday council meeting and presented her analysis of the Eastern supply bottleneck to 7 elders who listened with the focused, evaluating attention of people who had too much at stake to listen any other way. The betrayal came from the direction she hadn't defended. She had thought about Kaylin's search parties. She had thought about Veer, whose usefulness made him dangerous in specific ways she'd had 12 years to catalog. She had thought about Corps, whose ambition was the kind that moved fast and asked questions afterward. She had thought about the Capital Court's information networks, which were extensive and capable. She had not thought about Davon. Davon was 22 years old and had arrived in Frostwind 3 weeks after Serena, hired as a supply runner for Holt's trading operation. He was quick and quiet and helpful in the specific way of someone who wanted to be noticed for being helpful, and Serena had assessed him in the first week as young and eager and essentially transparent, and she had stopped assessing him after that because transparent people rarely required sustained attention. This was the error. She understood it the moment Elder Mare appeared at her door on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before the follow-up council meeting, with an expression Serena had not seen on the woman's face before. The expression of someone who has discovered they have been made a participant in something they didn't agree to participate in. There are 2 men at the territory's south boundary, Maret said. They arrived last night. They're carrying Empire documentation and they're asking for a woman matching your description traveling under a shortened name. Serena's body went still. The way it went still when she was processing fast. Not frozen, just directed inward. Every physical system quieting to let the assessment run clean. How long has Davon been working for them? She said. Mara's expression shifted slightly. You already knew it was him. I should have known sooner. How long? I don't have that information. I have the fact of the men at the boundary and the fact that when I asked my boundary guard who might have sent word south about a woman named Seren in our territory, Davon's name came up. Marit's voice was even. She was containing something. Not anger exactly, but the controlled pressure of a person who has built a community carefully and has just found an unfamiliar hand in its machinery. He's been gone since yesterday morning. Already paid and gone then. Or taken and gone. Either way, gone. Serena thought about the 2 men at the south boundary with their Empire documentation. Kor wouldn't come himself, not to a first contact location. Kor was careful about deniability in the early stages. These would be scouts, verifiers. They would send word back and the actual retrieval would follow within days, moving faster once they had a confirmed location. She had days, maybe less. She looked at Maret. I owe you an honest account, she said. Yes, Maret said. You do. Serena told her. Not everything. Not the 12 years of granular damage, not the specific architecture of what she'd built and walked away from. But the relevant facts. Who she was, what she had left. That the men at the boundary were operating on the Alpha King's authority and would not stop at the territory line if they confirmed her presence. Maret listened without expression. When Serena finished, the silence lasted long enough to have weight. You came here because you needed somewhere to start over, Maret said finally. Yes. And you've been doing work that benefits this community. I've been trying to. The Eastern route analysis is solid. The Council agrees with the framework. Mara looked at her steadily. But you've also brought the Empire's attention to a territory that has specifically and deliberately avoided the Empire's attention for 60 years. There it was. The other side of the ledger, the one Serena had not let herself look at directly, because looking at it would have required asking a question she hadn't been ready to ask when she arrived. Yes, she said. I have. Maret stood. She moved to the window, Holt's supply room window, looking out at the market square, the ordinary weekday movement of a community going about its work. She stood there for a moment with her hands clasped behind her back. If they take you back, she said, not turning, what happens to the work we've started? It stops. And if you run again? The same men follow, possibly with more authority the second time. So your options are go back, run and be caught, or, Maret turned, stay and fight. Those aren't the same kind of fight, Serena said. No, they're not. Maret's pale brown eyes were doing the same calculations Serena's were, just from a different set of starting conditions. What does staying and fighting look like, specifically? Serena thought about this. She thought about it with the particular focus she brought to problems that didn't have a clean answer, the way she'd thought about the water rights mediation, about the grain distribution restructuring, about every situation where the resources available were not the resources the problem required, and the gap had to be crossed by something other than conventional means. It means I stop being Seren from the mid-territories, she said slowly. It means I tell the truth, the whole truth, to every territorial council that would listen. It means using everything I know about how the Empire's alliances actually work, and which of them are held together with genuine interest versus obligation, to build something that doesn't need the Empire's permission to function. A counterstructure. An alternative one. Different goal. Maret was quiet. You'd be declaring yourself, she said. Luna Serena Ashvale, publicly, in independent territory. That's not a private woman rebuilding her life. That's a political act. Yes, Serena said. It is. She hadn't said it out loud before. She had thought it, in the careful theoretical way she thought about things before they became decisions. But she had not said it, had not made it the kind of word that existed in a room with another person, and therefore became real in a different way than internal thought. She said it now and felt the dimensions of it settle around her like a new shape of responsibility, heavier than the festival cape had ever been, and entirely different in kind. Not assigned, not costumed, not 2 steps back and to the left. Chosen. Murray looked at her for a long time. "Thursday's council meeting," she said finally. "I'll send word to the adjacent settlements. If you're going to make a political act, you should make it in front of the people it affects." Serena nodded. Murray moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," she said, "the Eastern Route analysis is the clearest thinking I've seen applied to this territory's logistics in 20 years. A pause. "I don't say that to make you feel better. I say it because the council needs to hear it, and you needed to know it before Thursday." She left. Serena sat in the empty supply room, in the plain wooden chair, at the plain wooden table, and she looked at her hands flat against the surface, and she thought about what she had just said and what it meant. She had come to Frostwind to rebuild quietly, to find a pace and a ground, and a life that asked nothing of her that she hadn't agreed to give. She had planned for discovery. She had planned for Kalen's search parties, for the capital's reach, for the necessity of possibly moving again if the first ground didn't hold. She had planned for the slow, patient work of building credibility in a new place. She had not planned for the moment the slow, patient work became something else. She had not planned to stand up. The thing she understood now, sitting in Holt's supply room with the market sounds coming through the window and 2 Empire scouts at the south boundary and Thursday 4 days away, was that the plan she had made was built on one assumption that had just broken, that she could be small enough, careful enough, contained enough to rebuild without the Empire noticing, without Frostwind's independence being pulled into her orbit. Devon had broken that assumption. Whether he'd been paid from the start or found later and made an offer didn't matter. The mechanism of betrayal was less important than its consequence, which was this. There was no small anymore. The choice wasn't between staying quiet and speaking. The choice was between being retrieved and being immovable. She was 31 years old, and she had 12 years of knowledge about how empires actually functioned, held in her memory with the specific clarity of someone who had built the invisible half of one. She had relationships with territorial representatives across 4 regions. She had Fen. She had Murray. She had the Eastern Route analysis and the grain distribution framework and the water rights methodology and 100 other pieces of structural knowledge that had lived in her head and her files and her years of quiet, unglamorous work. She had, she realized, been building her position without knowing she was building it. The plan had simply arrived at its actual purpose before she'd been ready to recognize it. She pressed her hands flat against the table. Cold wood, solid ground. Thursday, she thought. She would need to write to Fen tonight. She would need the Thornwall connection formalized in a different way than she had originally considered. She would need to think carefully about what she said, and in what order and to whom, because the first word she spoke in Thursday's council as herself, not Seren, not the Luna of a distant empire, but Serena Ashvale, who had spent 12 years learning exactly which levers held which weights. Those words would be the foundation of everything that came after. She could not build a thing that would last on a foundation she hadn't chosen with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She had done that once already. She was not going to do it again. Outside the window, the market went on. The cold came off the ridge in its honest way, telling her exactly where she stood. She picked up a pen. She began to write. The letter to Fen took 3 drafts. The first was too careful. The language of someone still thinking in the register of court correspondence. Hedging, qualifying, leaving exits built into every sentence the way you leave exits built into agreements you aren't certain will hold. She read it back and recognized it as the writing of a woman who still half believed she might need to retreat, and she burned it in the supply room's small iron stove and started again. The second was too raw. She had written it fast, the way you write when something has broken open and the words come out ahead of the thinking, and there were things in it that were true but not yet useful. The kind of truth that serves the person writing rather than the person reading. She burned that one too. The third was the right length and the right temperature. It said, I need Thornwall's formal recognition of Frostwind as an independent non-empire territory. Not diplomatic acknowledgement, formal recognition. On record, with your seal. I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs you with Kalen. I'm asking anyway because I believe the cost to you is recoverable, and the cost to Frostwind of not having it is not. I have until Thursday to build something worth protecting. Tell me what you need from me to make this possible. She gave it to Holt's supply runner at dawn, not Davin's route, a different one, a woman named Chorus, who had been running the Northern Trade Circuit for 20 years and had the particular reliability of someone for whom consistency was a source of pride rather than simply a job requirement. Then she sat at the plain wooden table and waited for Thursday. Thursday came with a hard wind off the ridge and a sky the particular flat gray that meant the temperature was going to drop before the day was out. The council room was a long rectangular space above the market's grain storage, accessible by an external staircase, heated by 2 iron stoves that worked adequately if you were wearing enough layers. 7 chairs for the 7 elders, a standing space for the person addressing the council. No gallery, no formal audience section. In Frostwind, council meetings were open to anyone who wanted to stand in the available floor space, and available floor space was limited. It was not limited today. Serena climbed the staircase and found the room holding approximately 40 people, the 7 elders in their chairs, and behind the standing space, pressed against the walls and into the corners, the kind of crowd that forms when word travels through a small community that something significant is about to happen, and people want to see it rather than hear it secondhand. She recognized faces. The trader from the East Market who had complained about supply costs, 2 of the younger pack members she had spoken with about the root bottleneck, Holt, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed and his evaluating expression. She stood in the standing space. She said her name, her full name. She said where she had come from and what she had been before she crossed the Frostwind border, and she said it plainly, without the court register that would have made it sound like a formal declaration, because she was not making a declaration. She was making a case, and the difference between those 2 things mattered. The room was very quiet through most of it. When she finished, Elder Moret said, "Questions." The questions ran for an hour and a half. They were the right questions. Specific, practical, occasionally blunt in the way of people who did not have the luxury of asking anything other than what they actually needed to know. What did the Empire's recognition versus non-recognition actually mean for trade routes? What exposure did Frostwind take on if they formally sheltered a person the Alpha King was looking for? What was she actually proposing, in terms that could be implemented and evaluated rather than aspired to? She answered all of them. She answered them with the 12 years of structural knowledge she had spent 12 years accumulating, and she answered them in the plain language she had spent 6 weeks learning was the language this room understood and trusted, and somewhere in the second hour she felt the room's temperature shift. Not warmly, not with the soft approval of an audience that had decided to like her, but with the harder, more useful quality of people who were beginning to take the information seriously. Moret called the formal vote at the end of the second hour. 5 in favor. 1 abstention. 1 against. When Serena walked back down the external staircase into the cold, flat gray day, Elder Mare's recognition of her presence in Frostwind as a permanent resident, not a refugee, not a guest, a resident with standing in the Territorial Council's deliberations, was formally on record. It wasn't everything. It was a foundation. Fenn's reply came 6 days later, faster than Serena had calculated, which told her the Thornwall ambassador had been moving before the letter arrived, had been, perhaps, preparing for this request since the morning she'd sent back a single word. Good. The reply was longer than Fenn's usual brevity. It said, "Formal recognition requires the full council, which meets in 3 weeks. I can deliver 5 votes with confidence and a 6th with work. The 7th is Councillor Drev, who is cautious by nature and will need a specific argument about Thornwall's material interest. Not principle, not alliance loyalty, interest. Build me that argument and send it before the council date. As to what this costs me with Kaelin, I have been in this work for 31 years. I know what I'm buying and what I'm spending. Do not carry that weight for me." Then, at the end, "The scouts at your south boundary withdrew 4 days ago. I do not know if this is Kaelin reconsidering his approach or Vire reconsidering it for him. Watch your north boundary as well." Serena read the last line twice. She walked to the window. She looked at the ridge line above the village. The ice up there caught the afternoon light on clear days and threw it back in a particular way she had started to recognize as one of the visual signals of the territory's weather patterns. Watch your north boundary. Vire, not core, Vire would not make the mistake of sending men in from the direction they'd already established. Veer moved laterally. Veer had 30 years of court strategy in him, and he operated the way water operated, finding the shape of the available space and filling it. She spent the next 4 days drafting the argument for Counselor Drev. It was the most focused work she had done since leaving the capital. Narrow, specific, built entirely on the material interest calculus of a mid-sized independent territory, choosing between two futures. One where it maintained its relationship with an empire that was beginning to show structural strain, and one where it positioned itself as a founding member of an alternative regional alliance before that alliance's terms were set by someone else. She sent it north with Chorus on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, the North Boundary Guard found 2 men camped in the tree line. They were not Empire Scouts in any official sense. No documentation, no formal authority, markers, no Empire colors. They were carrying trade registration papers from a mid-territory merchant house. Legitimate papers, well-forged. The kind of papers that Veer's network could produce because Veer had been building his network for decades, and he did not produce poor work. One of them had, on his person, a sealed letter with Serena's full name on the outside. The North Boundary Guard brought the letter to Moret. Moret brought it to Serena. Serena looked at the seal. Not Kalen's seal. Veer's personal seal. The Veer family sigil, the one he used for private correspondence rather than official Empire business. She opened it. It was short. Veer wrote short when he wanted to seem unthreatening. It said, "You built something impressive. I've been watching it from the South Boundary withdrawal, and I understand now what you're doing. The Alpha King doesn't understand it yet, but he will, and when he does, his response will not be measured. Come back on your own terms before those terms are set for you. I can guarantee you a formal renegotiation of your position, title, authority, defined scope. Real power, recognized. This offer does not stay open indefinitely." She read it standing in the council room, Murray beside her, the stoves burning against the afternoon cold. She folded it. She thought about Vire's face in the courtyard the night of the festival, the way he had looked away into the middle distance when the air between her and Kalen turned edge-sharp, the way he had always operated, convenient, useful, never cruel, because cruelty was inefficient and Vire ran on efficiency. He was offering her, in precise and careful language, a negotiated return. Real power. Defined scope. He was smart enough to know she wouldn't come back for reconciliation. He was smart enough to offer her function instead, because he had watched the structural consequences of her absence for 10 weeks, and he understood now what Voss had understood in the first hour. He was also smart enough to include the warning wrapped in the offer. His response will not be measured. Kalen was coming. Not the scouts, not the search parties, Kalen himself. She knew this the way she knew certain things about him that 12 years of close proximity had installed in her like instruments. Not instinct exactly, but a calibrated reading of his patterns. He had tried the procedural method, search parties, documentation, formal retrieval authority. That had failed. He had tried, or allowed Veer to try, the strategic offer. She had not taken it. What came next in his pattern was not escalation of the strategy. It was abandonment of strategy altogether. Kalen Draven did not strategize indefinitely. He reached a point where the cost of continued maneuvering exceeded the cost of direct action, and then he moved directly. She had days, perhaps less. "He's coming personally," she said. Murray looked at her. "How certain?" "Certain enough to plan for it." Murray was quiet for a moment, then, "What does that change?" Serena thought about it. Everything, she thought, and nothing. "It accelerates the timeline," she said. "It means the Thornwall Council vote needs to happen before he arrives, not after. It means I need every adjacent territory that's been in conversation with us to commit in writing before this week is out." She paused. "And it means I need to be here when he comes." "You could move?" "Again." "No." The word was immediate and certain. The way certain things are certain, not because you've reasoned them, but because the reasoning happened somewhere below the level of deliberate thought and arrived already complete. "I'm done moving, Jim." Kalen arrived on a Friday. He came with 6 men and no Empire banner, which told her everything about the nature of this visit. Unofficial, deniable, carrying the specific tension of a powerful person who has decided to operate outside the structures that define their power. He rode hard from the southern approach, and the Frostwind boundary guard did not stop him because the boundary guard's instructions were to observe and report, not intercept. Serena was in the market square when the report reached her. She finished the conversation she was having with the supply coordinator about the Eastern Route implementation. They were 3 weeks into the framework, and the first results were showing in prices. The real-world confirmation of the analysis, the kind of evidence that makes other people's positions on a council easier to hold. And she thanked him and walked to the clearing at the edge of the square where the main approach from the south boundary road came in. She stood there. She was wearing the plain clothes she had been wearing for 10 weeks. No cape, no combs, no symbols of any designation other than her own. He came around the tree line at the road's bend and pulled up when he saw her. He looked different from 100 yards. She registered this the way you register a change in familiar terrain, noting it, locating it, understanding what it means. He had ridden hard and not slept recently, and the architecture of his face had lost some of the court-managed quality that usually sat over it. The layer of deliberate presentation that 12 years of alpha kingship had built into his default expression. What was underneath it was harder and less certain. He dismounted. He walked toward her alone. His men stayed back. She did not move. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that the space between them was the kind of space that existed for specific reasons. He looked at her. She looked back at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and in that moment she was aware of the extraordinary strangeness of it, standing in a Frostwind market clearing in plain clothes, looking at the Alpha King of the Empire she had walked out of, and feeling not afraid, not pulled, not the complicated gravity that had operated in her chest for most of the 12 years she had known him. Just clear, quiet, solidly located in herself. He was the one who had always had the power in every room they'd ever shared. He had the title, the crown, the territorial authority, the pack strength. She had stood 2 steps back and to his left for 12 years. She was standing in front of him now. "Serena," he said. His voice was stripped down. None of the care he had had when he addressed a courtyard or a council, the Alpha King's practice projection. Just his voice underneath all of that. "Kaelin," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Something moved through his expression. She had been reading his face for 12 years and she still couldn't fully name what it was. Not the recalculation she had imagined. Not anger. Not the cold strategic focus. Something that sat between those things and something else. Something the court register didn't have a clean word for. "Come back," he said. 2 words. No elaboration, no negotiation, no formal offer. Just the stripped-down version of every letter and rider and scout he'd sent in the 10 weeks since she'd walked out the east kitchen gate. She looked at him. She thought about the south gallery window. The 3 seconds she had watched before she turned away. The fact that the turning away had not hurt the way it used to hurt. She thought about Thursday's council vote. Fenn's letter. Marae's pale brown eyes, the Eastern route prices coming down in the 3rd week. The supply coordinator she had just spoken with. The 53 people who had shown up to a council meeting to hear what she had to say. She thought about the folded paper in her coat pocket and the words on it that had been true for years before she'd been ready to act on them. She drew a breath. "No," she said. The word landed the way quiet words land when they are carrying a long time's worth of weight. Not loud, not dramatic, but with a density that made the surrounding air feel different for a moment. His jaw moved. His eyes held hers. "Serena, I heard you," she said. "My answer is no." She held his gaze. "You rode here without a banner, without official documentation. You left the Empire in the middle of a structural crisis that is going to get significantly worse before it gets better, and you rode here with 6 men to say 2 words to me. You had 10 weeks of messengers and letters and riders to say 2 words, and you didn't say them. You sent scouts. You sent Vire. I'm here now." "Yes." She let the words settle. "You are. 10 weeks after I left. You're here because the Empire is showing you every day what I was worth to it, and you finally couldn't sit still anymore. And you rode here, and you said come back as though the problem between us is a distance problem." She kept her voice even. Not cold, not angry, just accurate, the same way the Frostwind cold was accurate. "The problem between us is not a distance problem." His face was doing something she had not seen before. She registered it with the same careful attention she brought to anything she hadn't seen before. noting it without rushing toward an interpretation. "I know that," he said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the writing. "I know what the problem is." "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, his 6 men waited at the road's edge. Around her, at the periphery of the market square, she could feel without looking the presence of Frostwind people who had noticed the arrival and were giving her space while staying within witness distance. The community reflex of people who had decided she was one of theirs and were not going to look away while someone came for her. Kalen's eyes moved briefly to the market square behind her. He registered the same presence she had felt. He understood what it meant. She could see him understand it, the way his assessment of the situation recalibrated in real time. "You built something here," he said. "Yes." "In 10 weeks." "Yes." His jaw set. "You built something here in 10 weeks, and you spent 12 years—" He stopped. He looked at the ground for a moment, and the looking down was the thing she had never seen from him before, not once in 12 years, and she felt the weight of it without letting it move her. He looked back up. "I came here to bring you back," he said. "I'm standing here, and I can see that's not what's going to happen, and I don't—" The rough quality in his voice deepened. "I don't know what happens next." "I do," she said. He waited. She drew a breath. "What happens next is that in 4 days the Thornwall Council votes on formal recognition of a multi-territory independent alliance with Frostwind at its center. What happens next is that 3 adjacent territories sign a mutual aid compact that doesn't require the Empire's endorsement or permission. What happens next is that you go back to your Empire and you deal with the crisis your Empire is in, because that crisis is real. And your people are in it regardless of what's happening between you and me." His eyes had gone very still. "And you," he said, "what happens to you?" "I lead what I've built." The words were simple and certain. She had not said them to anyone yet, had said the version of them to Marais, the contextual version, but not the clean direct version that was available now, here, in a market clearing with the flat gray frostwind sky above them and 12 years of everything between them turning into something that could finally be looked at straight on. "I do the work I've always been doing, except now I do it under my own name." Kalen looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. He had ridden here to retrieve what he had considered his. He was standing in a frostwind market, clearing understanding, for the first time, what he had actually had, and what it had cost him, and what the cost was going to keep being. She could see the understanding moving through him the way weather moves through a landscape, changing the look of everything it touches. He had never been the kind of man who broke visibly. He did not break now. But something shifted. Some structural thing, somewhere deep, and she felt it without moving toward it, the way you feel a change in the wind before the weather arrives. She thought, there it is. There's the thing that took 12 years and 10 weeks to exist. "Too late," said the part of her that had been keeping the ledger. The part that had absorbed everything, that had pressed its hand against cold stone to find ground, that had folded and refolded a piece of paper until the creases were soft. Too late, she thought. And the saying of it was not cruel and not triumphant, just true. She drew breath to speak, to say the last necessary thing, the thing that would close this particular space between them, so that what came next could begin on terms they both understood. And then one of his 6 men called out from the road's edge, urgent, sharp. And Kalen turned, and she turned, and they both saw at the same moment the riders coming from the southern tree line at speed. And the riders were not his men, and the standard they carried was not an Empire standard. It was the standard of the Keldrath Alliance, the Eastern coalition that had been testing the Empire's borders for 2 years, the one she had read intelligence reports about in her last months at the capital, the one that had been waiting, the intelligence suggested, for a specific kind of weakness to present itself before it moved. 7 riders, armed, moving with the purposeful speed of people who had been waiting for a signal and had received it. Kalen's hand went to his sword. Serena's mind ran the calculation in the time it took to draw breath. 7 armed riders from Keldrath, arriving at the moment the Alpha King was alone in independent territory with 6 men and no official standing. The timing was not coincidence. Someone had told them Kalen was here. Unprotected, outside his borders, politically exposed. Someone had given them exactly the window they needed. Serena looked at the riders. She looked at Kalen's 6 men moving to intercept. She looked at Kalen, sword half drawn, turning back toward her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the strategic cold, not the Alpha King's authority, but the raw, unguarded look of a man who has just understood that the danger is larger than he calculated and his resources are fewer than he needs. She looked at the market square behind her, at the Frostwind faces watching, at Maret, who had appeared at the square's edge and whose pale brown eyes met Serena's across the distance with the specific look of a woman waiting to see what the woman she'd vouched for was going to do. Serena made the decision in the space between one breath and the next. She turned to the square and she said, loud and clear, in the voice she had trained for 12 years to carry without effort, "Close the South Road. All of it. Now." The South Road closed in under 4 minutes. Frostwind did not have a standing army. What it had was 40 years of practiced community response to threats that arrived without warning from the ridge and the tree lines and the unpredictable border territories. And what that practice had built was something that looked like chaos from the outside and operated like precision from the inside. Holt appeared at the square's east entrance with 8 men carrying the kind of tools that were also weapons when the situation required it. 2 of the Elder Council's younger representatives moved to the road's flanking positions without being told because they had drilled these positions since they were old enough to understand what the drill was for. Maurice stood at the square's edge and watched all of it with the expression of someone confirming that what they had built was holding. The 7 Keldrath riders pulled up at the South Road's closure point. They had not expected resistance. Serena could see this in the way they recalibrated, the horses shifting under riders who were reassessing. Keldrath's intelligence on Frostwind had apparently carried the same assessment the Empire's records had: remote, sparse, negligible. A soft entry point to reach an exposed Alpha King. They had not factored Frostwind into the calculation as a variable. They had factored it as a backdrop. That was their error, and it was the same error people had been making about things she'd built for 12 years. Kalen's 6 men had formed a defensive position at the road's bend, swords drawn, and Kalen himself was standing at the edge of that position with his hand on his hilt and his face doing the fast cold assessment she recognized as his combat register. Everything else stripped away, just the calculation of force and angle and probability. He was outnumbered at his position, his 6 against their 7, and his 6 had ridden hard and his 7 were fresh. He knew this. She could see him know it. She walked to him. He turned when she reached his shoulder. "They're not here for you," he said, low and fast. "Or not only. This is a message. Keldrath doesn't send 7 riders to take a head. They send 7 riders to make a point. The point being that you're outside your territory without protection, and they know it. Yes. So this is theater. Theater with swords." She looked at the 7 riders. They were holding their position at the road closure, which told her Kalen was right. They were waiting, not attacking. Waiting for an audience to form, waiting for the scene to develop. "They want you to look weak in front of an independent territory," she said. "Yes." "And if you draw?" 7 against 6, in a territory that has no obligation to back me, and Keldrath gets a diplomatic incident they can use for the next decade. His jaw was set. "So I don't draw. Then what do you do?" He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man working against his own instincts, because the instincts in this specific situation were going to make things worse. "I don't know, he said. And the saying of it cost him something. She could hear the cost in the stripped-down quality of the words, the absence of the Alpha King's certainty. "I've spent 20 years knowing what I do. Right now I don't know." She looked at the riders. She looked at the road closure. She looked at Marais, who was watching her with the pale brown eyes that had been watching her for 10 weeks. "I do," she said. But she walked to the road closure point alone. She heard Kalen say her name behind her. Not a command, just her name. The way you say a word when you reach for something and find the shape of it different than you expected. She didn't stop. The Keldrath riders watched her come. Their leader was a broad man, mid-40s, carrying the kind of stillness that came from experience rather than composure. The genuine article, not performance. He looked at her the way experienced people look at unknowns, without dismissal, without commitment, just assessment. She stopped at arm's length from the road closure point and looked up at him. "You know who I am," she said. He considered this. Word travels. Then you know I'm not the Alpha King's envoy. I'm not his representative. I'm not speaking for the Empire. She held his gaze steadily. I'm speaking for Frostwind territory, which is where you are right now. The rider looked at the road closure, at Holt's men, at the flanking positions. He looked back at her. Frostwind doesn't have formal standing, he said. Frostwind has Thornwall recognition, filed 3 days ago. This was a compression of the truth. The Thornwall vote had passed, Fenn's message had arrived that morning, the formal documentation was in transit. The substance was accurate. The timing was tight. And Frostwind has my name on its council record, which means whatever you do here today is done in front of a witness whose name will be on every formal complaint I file with every independent territory on this continent before the week is out. The writer looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not move. She did not look away. She was 31 years old, and she had built things and watched them get filed without her name, and endured what enduring had cost her, and crossed into independent territory with a satchel and a piece of paper. And 10 weeks later, she was standing at a road closure point telling a Keldrath advance rider the precise cost of what he was considering, and she was not afraid. She was the clearest she had been in 12 years. The rider looked past her at Kaelin, a long, assessing look, the kind of look that was doing its own calculation. Then he looked back at her. We'll withdraw to the boundary, he said. This conversation will continue through formal channels. It will, she said. I look forward to it. He pulled his horse's head around. The 7 riders withdrew in the compact, disciplined way of people who had decided that this particular theater had run its course. They did not hurry. Hurrying would have cost them something on the way out, and experienced people don't pay unnecessary costs. She watched them go. She turned back to the square. Kaelin was standing where she had left him. His 6 men had lowered their weapons. The Frostwind positions were holding, but the tension had dropped by several degrees. She could feel it in the quality of the air, the way the crowd at the square's edge had shifted from the tight stillness of alert to the looser posture of people who have just watched something resolve without casualties. She walked back to him. He looked at her the way she had looked at the Keldrath rider, with genuine assessment, without the overlay of assumption. How did you know they'd stand down? He said. I didn't. She said it plainly. I knew what they were trying to accomplish, and I knew what would make that accomplishment cost more than they'd paid for. The rest was a judgment call. If you'd been wrong, I've been making judgment calls in situations where being wrong had serious consequences for 12 years, she said. I just wasn't the one with the sword in my hand when I made them. He was quiet. Behind her, she heard the Frostwind positions beginning to stand down, the quiet directives of people managing the return to ordinary function, the specific sounds of a community absorbing something significant, and then, because it has work to do and always has had work to do, getting back to it. Kaelin looked at the space around them, at the square, at the people, at the supply coordinator she had been talking to when he arrived, who was now back at his table making notes with the focused manner of a man who had briefly looked up at an extraordinary thing and then returned to his ordinary work. You built this, Kaelin said again. But it was different from the first time he'd said it, standing at the road's edge with the flat strategic assessment he'd arrived with. It was something else now, something that had been worked over and come out different on the other side. Frostwind built itself, she said. I helped them see a couple of things clearly. That's not... He stopped. He looked at his hands. That's what you always said, about the Empire. What you did was help people see things clearly. I never... He stopped again. She waited. I never saw it, he said, as what it was. I saw it as management, administration, your function. He said the last word the way you repeat something that has been sitting in you for a while, working. I said that to you, the night of the festival, your function. Yes? I've thought about that a great deal in the last 10 weeks. I imagine you have... He looked at her. The rawness from before was still there. Underneath the surface he had reassembled during the confrontation with the Keldrath riders. She could see it the way she could see the ridge ice from the village. It didn't go anywhere just because you weren't looking directly at it. I'm not here to argue for a return, he said. I rode here to do that. I'm not doing it. I know. I'm here because I needed to see... He paused. I needed to see you, as you are now, because I spent 12 years not seeing you as you were. and I needed to know if I could. She held his gaze. This was the conversation she had not planned for. She had planned for the retrieval attempt, for the negotiation, for the political confrontation. She had not planned for this particular thing, the stripped-down version of him, standing in a frostwind market clearing, asking her for a kind of witnessing she had needed from him for 12 years and was not in a position to give back. She thought about what it cost to say a true thing too late. She thought about the 12 years of it, and she thought about the fact that the cost of truth said too late is paid by both people. Not one, paid differently, at different rates, but paid. I see you, she said carefully. I see what you're carrying, and I believe it's real. She held his gaze. And I need you to understand that what's real for you right now does not change what was real for me then. Both of those things are true at the same time. He received this. She could see him receive it. The way it landed, the way he didn't deflect or reframe or manage it, just took the weight of it. Yes, he said. I know. Go back, she said. Not unkindly, the way you say a true and necessary thing to someone who already knows it and needs to hear it from outside themselves. Go back to your empire. Deal with Keldrath through formal channels. Send the documentation to Marit's office, and we'll add our territorial record to the complaint. Fix the water rights mediation. I'll send you the framework I was using, because your people need that water, and my leaving shouldn't be what stops them getting it. Fix the distribution network. Find the structural failures and fix them with the same care that built them, and do it this time under the names of the people who are actually doing the work. He was quiet for a long moment. And us, he said. The question was small, and he knew it was small, and he asked it anyway, which she thought was probably the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. There is no us in the way there was, she said. There can be something else. Two leaders of separate territories who deal with each other in good faith. She paused. That's worth something. It's worth building carefully. You'd work with me. I work with everyone who's willing to work fairly. She held his gaze. That is not a small thing. It's actually the thing I've always been best at. He looked at her for a long time. Then he did something she had seen from him exactly once before. He looked down, not in defeat, in something quieter and more genuine than defeat. The look of a man taking stock of a landscape he is responsible for, including the parts of it he has damaged. I'm sorry, he said. 2 words, same as come back. But these two landed differently. These two had the weight of something that had been carried a long way and was being set down carefully, in the right place, without expectation of what the setting down would get him. She heard them. She let them be what they were. I know, she said. Yeah. He left before sundown. She watched his party ride south from the edge of the market square. 6 men and an alpha king who looked from the back exactly like what he was. Powerful and responsible for a great deal, and going back to face both of those things with whatever he had brought back from this place. She stayed until they were past the tree line. Murray appeared beside her. They stood together for a moment in the particular quiet that follows something large. He meant it, Maret said. Not a question. Some of it he's meant for a while, Serena said. Some of it he's just now meaning. Both are true. Does it change anything? Serena considered this honestly. She thought about the question as it deserved to be thought about. Not the quick protective reflex of no, it changes nothing, and not the opposite pull toward something soft and unearned, but the actual question of whether a man meaning a true thing too late, and knowing it was too late, and saying it anyway with nothing to gain from the saying, whether that changed the shape of anything going forward. It means working together is possible, she said finally, in the way I told him. 2 territories, good faith, fair terms. She paused. That's not nothing, for the people on both sides. No, Maret agreed. It's not nothing. They stood in the cooling afternoon. The supply coordinator had packed up his table and gone. The market vendors were covering their stalls. The eastern ridge was doing its afternoon thing with the ice and the light, throwing back a cold, clean brightness that was, Serena had come to understand, one of the specific beautiful things about this place. Not the dramatic beauty of empire architecture or the designed beauty of courtyard ceremonies, but the honest beauty of a landscape being exactly what it was. Thursday next, Maret said, the adjacent territory compacts. I'll have the language drafted by Tuesday. Chorus can run the North Circuit by Wednesday if you have it to her early. I'll have it to her early. Moret nodded once. The business established, the next step located, the work continuing. This was the register Serena had come to trust more than any other. The register of people who had work to do and did it. Who located the next step not because the next step was glorious, but because the next step was necessary, and necessary things were worth doing with care. She reached into her coat pocket. The folded paper was there. Soft with handling, she took it out. She held it for a moment, feeling the familiar give of the creases. She thought about the woman who had written it down in a stranger's archive room, 20-some years old, hearing an old wolf talk about endurance and feeling something in the words lock into place like a key finding a tumbler. She thought about the drawer it had lived in, the time she had pressed her hand against cold stone and read it back to herself to find ground. She thought about the morning she had put it in a satchel instead of leaving it behind. She unfolded it one more time. She read it. The handwriting was hers, younger. The letters a little more careful than her current hand, the hand of someone who wrote things down because she wasn't yet sure she would remember them. There's a point where staying isn't strength anymore. It's just the habit of pain pretending it's commitment. She stood in the market square of Frostwind territory, with the afternoon light coming off the ridge, and she read those words for the last time. Then she folded the paper along its worn creases, and she walked to the iron stove at the edge of the square that the market vendors used for warmth on cold days, and she opened the grate, and she put the paper in. It caught quickly. Small, bright flame. Gone. She closed the grate. She stood there for a moment, hands in her coat pockets, empty of the folded paper for the first time in years. She didn't need it anymore. The words had done their work. They had carried her across the distance between the person who needed to read them and the person who had already learned what they said. Learned it not from paper but from 10 weeks of cold mornings and plain bread and council meetings and a market clearing and a man who had ridden a long way to say 2 words that arrived years too late and meant something anyway. She had nothing left to prove to herself. That was the thing about arriving somewhere you actually chose. There was no test at the end of it, no moment of confirmation. Just the quiet, ordinary fact of standing in a place you built toward, with work to do tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. She walked back across the square. 3 years later, the treaty came to the table. It was a practical document, territorial trade terms, border protocols, mutual aid frameworks, water rights jurisdiction that she had drafted the model for, and both sides had refined over 18 months of careful negotiation. 26 pages. Every clause reviewed by the relevant councils, every term tested against the interests of the people who would live under it. They signed it in the neutral ground of a border way station, the same kind of plain-built structure she had eaten bread and hard cheese in the first night she crossed into Frostwind, which she thought was probably appropriate. Kalen arrived with his senior counsel and his formal documentation and the Empire's seal. Serena arrived with Moret and the Alliance's legal representative and the 7 territory seals. They sat across a plain wooden table. They signed. Kalen's hand moved across the document with the decisive stroke she recognized. She signed below, in her own name, Serena Ashvale, Alliance seat, Frostwind territory, in the handwriting that was now a little different from the careful younger hand that had written on a piece of paper she had burned. When it was done, the witnesses signed. The seals were pressed. The document was copied into both formal records. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the table. He looked like a man who had spent 3 years doing the work that the crisis had demanded of him. The architectural quality of his face had changed again. Not softer, not diminished, but different in a way she didn't have a precise word for. Something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had been worked through rather than around. She thought he looked like someone she might have been able to work beside if things had been different. If the years had been different. That thought arrived and she held it honestly, and then she let it go, because the honest version of it also included the truth that the things she had built in the 3 years since the market clearing, the alliance, the compacts, the real and durable relationships between 7 territories that had learned to trust each other through the slow work of actually working together. None of that existed in the version of her life where things had been different. All of it was consequence of what she had walked through, not in spite of it. Some things you can only build on the far side of the cost. Good treaty, she said. Good treaty, he said. His voice had the stripped-down quality she had heard in the market clearing. The real register, underneath the Alpha King's projection. Fair terms. Fair terms, she agreed. They shook hands across the table. Formal, clean, the grip of two people who understood exactly what they were to each other. Not enemies, not partners in the old sense, but something without a simpler name. Two leaders who had both been changed by the same years and were now building separate futures that would need to coexist, and had decided to coexist honestly rather than otherwise. His hand was warm. She had forgotten that specific fact about him. The warmth of his hands, the physical reality of a person she had known for 12 years and was now knowing differently. She noted it the way she noted the ridge ice and the market prices and the quality of the frostwind cold. She let go. He let go. She gathered her copies of the treaty, and she walked to the door, and outside the way station the morning was clear and cold, and the sky was the deep blue that in frostwind came before the wind picked up and brought the real cold off the ridge. Marais was waiting outside, coat collar up, reading something on a small document she had pulled from her bag. "Done?" Marit said without looking up. "Done." Marit folded the document and tucked it away. She looked at Serena's face with the pale brown assessment she had been applying to things for 68 years. "Good?" she said. Serena thought about the word. She thought about the first time Fenn had asked her a version of that question in a courtyard that felt like a long time ago, and the answer she had given then. "I'm enduring." Not the same as well. She thought about what the true answer was now. "Yes," she said. Simple. Accurate. Nothing performed in it. Marit nodded once. They walked together toward the horses, the treaty copies in Serena's bag, the next week's work already beginning to assemble itself in the specific functional part of her mind that was always thinking about what came next. The Eastern Route expansion. The new supply coordinator Holt had recommended. The junior council appointment that was 6 months overdue and needed to happen before the autumn sessions. The wind picked up off the ridge as they mounted. Cold and honest, the way Frostwind wind was honest, telling her exactly where she stood. She was 34 years old. She was not a queen. She did not want to be a queen. She was a woman who had walked out of a palace with a satchel and a folded piece of paper and built something on the far side of everything it had cost her. And the thing she had built was real and functional and full of the particular texture of things that have been made by hand, uneven in places, stronger for it, carrying the marks of the work. She had not won back a crown. She had done something that the crown, for all its weight and ceremony, had never let her do. She had chosen. That was the whole of it. Small enough to hold in one sentence, large enough to have taken 12 years and 10 weeks, and 3 more after that to arrive at. She rode north. The ridge caught the morning light and threw it back across the valley in a cold, clean brightness. The honest beauty of a landscape being exactly what it was, and the work waited ahead of her, and she rode toward it without looking back.